So that $800 puppy, which you bought cheap, will be an $8,000 puppy if you have to do hip surgery. If you want to understand how to create a breeding program and minimize risk in your breeding program, you have to have an understanding of the science behind inbreeding and line breeding. Dogs and wolves can interbreed. Are they a different species? No, they're the same species, and dogs are a subspecies of wolf. Basically, what it's saying is genetically, wolves and dogs are not different, and can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Out of 100 dogs that they trained for a year and a half, 100 dogs, guess how many dogs succeeded out of 100?
I mean,
3.
woo. Hey everybody, welcome back to another show. We are here with another special guest. That's our friend Mr. Alexander Gunther of Von Gunther House German Shepherds. How you doing today, sir?
How are you, sir? How are you, Joe?
I'm pretty
Nice
good.
to be here.
Nice to meet you finally. I've been seeing
Yes.
you online for a while. And
Thank you. You too. I also watch your videos. They're
yes,
very
sir.
good.
I'm glad you're here. Glad you're here. Could we start out by telling the audience a little bit about yourself?
I am somebody who was a German Shepherd fan for quite a long time. And I've had dogs since the late 80s. So 1988 was my first dog. I'm in my late 50s. I train dogs non-professionally, just as a hobby, for since that time, for over 30 years. I noticed in training dogs over time that until I got to the German Shepherd working lines, the training was not productive. A lot of the dogs I had were pet quality German Shepherds from American show lines, and they simply didn't have the genetics to do bite work or high level obedience. And I thought, well, maybe my training methods are not that good. And I read a lot of books on training, and I've attended dog clubs, Schutzen clubs. I've attended AKC shows. I've participated in AKC training events. The CD, the companion dog, the CDX, the novice. And in the Schutzen, there's the BH, which is the equivalent of the CD in AKC. You have Schutzen 1, Schutzen 2, Schutzen 3. And I've noticed that until I had my dog Jake, which was from working lines from Germany, his father was imported from Germany. And he was the son of the 3-time German national champion, Yukon van Perot, which I line breed upon, that dog. It wasn't until I saw how genetics plays a role in training that I didn't realize that with the right genetics, the training is basically done for you. Not to sound facetious that you don't have to do any work, but with the right genetics, training is easy. But with the wrong genetics, training is very hard because you can't build drive in a dog which lacks it in the first place. You can't install something which is not there. To make a human analogy, if somebody has a good singing voice, like a soprano or a tenor or a baritone, you have to just teach them to sing a song by teaching them the lyrics. They can already carry the tune. But if somebody like me, I don't know if you can hear my voice, I'm a little congested, but I don't have a singing voice. I can't sing. So I enjoy music, but I can't sing. So no matter how much you hire an opera trainer for me or a jazz trainer, whatever the music type you want to teach me, I cannot be taught to sing. I lack that musical ability. Same thing with dogs. You can't train what's not there. So after being involved in training German Shepherds primarily, I've also trained other breeds, but German Shepherds readily take to training. I then realized how much genetics affects ability to learn. Not that dogs are dumb, but there are certain drives which need to be there, especially for protection. And I then got an interest in breeding. I started breeding in 2019. I've produced a few litters. I'm not a commercial scale breeder. I don't create a large number of dogs for commercial purposes. I do take breeding very seriously because I feel that once you embark upon breeding and you're working a 9 to 5 job and you're gone for 10 hours a day, well, those puppies depend upon you to be there for them. For their very first 3 weeks are critical. My puppies might die if they're not fed every 2 hours. They can't control their body heat in the first 3 days. And you are totally obligated to protect those puppies if you took on breeding dogs. So even if you're doing it commercially, there's a moral obligation involved that, forgive my voice, I have a bit of a chest cold.
Okay.
Um, you have a moral obligation in front of those animals to treat the mama dog right, and you have to maintain. In other words, it's a lot of work to raise a litter correctly, and then the socialization of litter, playing all kinds of musical sounds for them, vacuum cleaner sound, drill sound, faucet sound, household noises. You want to desensitize them to household noises. You want to handle them a lot. So breeding dogs responsibly is not a light undertaking. And by responsibly, I mean doing OFA. HIP, for those who don't know, OFA stands for the Orthopedic Foundation of Animals. In Germany, there's the equivalent called the A stamp, but in the US, there's the Pen Hip score and the OFA. I use the OFA.
Mhm.
Unless a dog can pass an OFA hip score, where the hip socket doesn't fall out of the pelvis properly, I don't breed them. And for those who want to buy dogs at the lowest cost, possible cost, well, what kind of genetic testing was done that you can buy a puppy at such a low cost? Because remember, hip surgery is 4 to 5 thousand per hip.
Mhm.
So 2 hips is $8,000.
Yeah.
So that $800 puppy, which you bought cheap, will be an $8,000 puppy if you have to do hip surgery. So get it from the right breeder, which has standards. So basically, what am I? I'm a hobby breeder that takes breeding seriously. I do genetic testing, especially for degenerative myelopathy, which is a disease in German Shepherds. Other breeds have other diseases, like Willebrand's disease may be common to Dobermans, for example.
Mhm.
So you can test for every disease under the sun. Dobermans have specific diseases to their breed. Dalmatians have a disease specific to their breed. In other words, no breed is disease free. You can do about 153 genetic tests from Embark, and for a very low cost. And OFA is more expensive by far to get hip
No, yeah.
X-rays. But
Mhm.
Embark.vet, I'm not affiliated with them. I'm just mentioning their name. I think if you're going to breed dogs, you have the responsibility to create genetically free, disease-free dogs as much as possible. Because if you don't do it, you're passing on the healthcare costs from you, the breeder, to the buyer. And the buyer expects a healthy dog for what they're paying.
Mhm.
And temperament is one quality, and healthy genetics is a different quality. So you want both. You want the right temperament and the right health. That combined creates a healthy animal.
Mhm.
I think as a breeder, not just me, other breeders, we have a responsibility to do some kind of testing of the parent dogs before pairing them together. So I follow a rigorous model where no dogs that I breed are not genetically tested and OFA hip tested. So all my puppies come with a hip and elbow guarantee because I only think it's right.
Right.
That's briefly what I do and how I
Mhm.
do it.
Right. Right. Now you got some really popular videos on YouTube when it comes to genetics. What is your background and what is how did you get into it so and able to explain it as deep as you can?
Well, I was a science major from 1985 to 1988. I was at Seton Hall University as a physics major. And then from 1990 till 1994, I went to NJIT in Newark as an electrical engineering major. So I have a physics background and an engineering background. As a science major, the first 2 years of your sciences, yeah, you have physics, you have chemistry, you have biology, you have statistics as part of your math courses, you have calculus, obviously.
Mhm.
The first 2 years of any science program is a foundation across any science major. In other words, if you're going to be a chemist, in year 3 of college, you'll take advanced biochemistry and organic chemistry. But year 1 and year 2, you're taking chemistry 1 and chemistry 2. You're taking biology 1 and biology 2. In other words, the foundation science program of almost all colleges that I'm aware of, at least when I was in college over 30 years ago, almost 40 years ago now, is the same. So my understanding of genetics comes from the fact that I had classes in statistics and statistical modeling. I don't go to that deep into it in my videos because it's overwhelming for most people. I don't want to go into that much into math, but I give a taste of it. And so, to make a long story short, I understand genetics as a science major. I wasn't a biology major, but I was a science major. So, my understanding of genetics and gene flow and coefficient of inbreeding and the biological understanding of the mammalian genome and how breeding mammals, which is different from breeding birds and reptiles. I'll get into that in a second.
Okay.
Um, it comes from my science background. Now, what I study doesn't directly apply to breeding dogs because breeding animals, you don't have to have a science degree to breed dogs. Anybody can breed dogs. You can put any male and female together and breed dogs. But if you want to understand how to create a breeding program and minimize risk in your breeding program, you have to have an understanding of the science behind inbreeding and line breeding. And one of the first people I talk about is Sewall Wright, who created an inbreeding coefficient in 1922. That's
Mhm.
100 years ago.
Yes.
And he was hired by the U.S. Agricultural Department because the cow herds were being, that's the phone ringing, I said ignore it.
Mhm.
um, he created a mathematical model of inbreeding so that you could maintain high milk production and a lot of meat and milk on the bone, but not have the diseases that come up when recessive traits combine, recessive genes combine, and therefore you have disease. So there is a compromise between when you inbreed too far and you have disease, but if you don't have any inbreeding or any line breeding whatsoever, you can't concentrate the traits you do want, which in the case of cows is a lot of meat and milk.
Right.
So if you were to breed cows with no program of any kind, you would not get a lot of yield per pound. In other words, you have an 800-pound bull.
Mhm.
You want as much meat for sale when that bull is slaughtered for beef as possible. Or let's say you're living in Africa and you're importing a cow from England, which has a lot of meat, milk, but
Mhm.
you're breeding it to an African cow which has the loose skin because they're resistant to malaria and they have a thicker skin. How do you take the genetics from two different gene pools, breed them together so you have the maximum milk, but you're also resistant to malaria?
Mhm.
How would you create a breed that's specific to that situation? Well, if you breed the African cow, it doesn't have a lot of meat and milk, but it resists malaria. If you breed the British cow, it can't live in that hot weather easily, but
Right.
it has a lot of meat because it was selectively bred for 100, 120 years. So how do you create a new breed? Um, and so without understanding the equations behind inbreeding, you're going to inbreed too far and you're going to have serious genetic diseases. If it's dogs, you're going to have cleft palates. You're going to have uh, all kinds of diseases, deformities. So you want to line breed to maximize the genetic potential of that animal,
Mhm.
but you don't want to take it that far that you will create disease. So, what is the basis of your reasoning? Well, we had geneticists for 100 plus years, like Sewall Wright, like Hardingman. There are many others, like Ballou in 1997. I mean, we have 78 years from 1922 until the year 2000. Call it 80 years, in round numbers,
Yes. Yes. Sir.
to understand genetic modeling. And that we had a lot of professional statisticians and biologists doing this. If we can take some of that mathematics and gobbledygook that most people can't understand because it's beyond their education level, and if we could boil it down to simple fractions, which is all there is,
Mhm.
most people can follow fractions. You could simplify the concepts and reduce risk. So the coefficient of inbreeding is nothing more than a measure of risk. If you can figure out at which number your risk coefficient is adequate for your particular breed and at which coefficient you've taken it too far, now you have a mathematical basis of analyzing the pedigree from which to dance. Otherwise, you're taking chances unnecessarily when you could have predicted risk mathematically before the breeding ever took place. And remember that inbreeding animal which has disease because you want to create a line, that's going to be somebody's pet in their home. So
Right.
do you want to sell sick dogs simply because you want to create a line? So there's a responsibility level involved
Yes, sir.
that you want to create a line because you want certain attributes. Let's say for dog sport, you want a dog which will work well in the Mondio ring or KNPV, the Dutch Royal Police Dog Sport, for those who don't know, or Schutzen, which is now called IGP.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to concentrate certain traits so that animal performs well in that sport, but you don't want to do where the dog is has lower fertility, poor liver health, poor eye health, poor physical structure, and in some breeds things have been taken too far. An
Mm-hmm.
example is the Showline German Shepherd, which has the roach back and terrible orthopedics,
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion, and it has gone too far. So I think that understanding genetics and creating a coefficient of inbreeding and understanding that the math behind it is the best thing we can do for the average hobby breeder. I think the hobby breeder has a responsibility to understand genetics because you can breed unrelated dogs completely. Yeah, you avoid any disease, but even unrelated dogs can have disease. So not necessarily inbreeding will cause disease. You have to pick the best possible animals which are disease free, and you have to know that pedigree. But if you do decide to create a line, don't breed too close. And when do you when do you have that? What is the relevant number that is applicable to you, and how do you figure that out?
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And when you say this it's a mathematical formula for those who us who don't got room for 20, 30, 40 dogs, hobby breeders, this mathematical formula will help us. Am I
Correct.
correct? Okay.
Correct. I want to share my screen really quick and share a page
Yes,
if you
sir.
don't mind.
Yes,
I'm going
do
to
it.
share a page. People they can refer to it after this.
Okay.
Bear with me as I open up this page.
Yes, sir.
Can you see this screen or not yet?
I can see it.
Okay. So this gentleman is Sewall Wright. This is a picture of him in 1954.
Hmm.
He was born in 1889, so he died in 1988. Lived almost a century. And he was the one who created the model of what's called the coefficient of inbreeding. He then created a model of what's called genetic drift. And the most important thing he created was called path analysis.
Hmm.
What that means is you calculate the number of paths, the common ancestor, as a way to calculate inbreeding. And that was done in 1921. And with that model, he can then calculate the coefficient of inbreeding. So if anybody wants to look him up, he was the first to create a model of how to calculate all this. As I said, he was hired by the U.S. Agricultural Department to prevent inbreeding too far, and he created a mathematical tool to help cow breeders from inbreeding their bulls too far in that cow herd. And he was an expert in mammalian genetics. He also did breeding of uh, it wasn't rats, it was guinea pigs, and
Okay.
he bred 80,000 guinea pigs, and he created a model based on that. So he was the founder of population genetics and inbreeding, and people will do well to understand his model. I'm gonna stop the screen,
Okay.
and the next person I'm gonna share this screen 1 second because it's important people to maybe read up on this stuff. It will help them, I think.
Okay.
Um, let me share this screen. So this article, bloodlines.net/high flyer coefficient at HTM. It's called Coefficient of Inbreeding, Comparing Wright's and Hartingman's Equation. Here's the equation right here that he wrote in 1922. And it says, let's understand this equation. It says f of x equals sigma 1 half to the N1 plus N2 plus 1 times 1 plus FA. So what does this mean? Half of your genes come from your father and half of your genes are from your mother. That's why it's half, because you don't get all your genes from your father, you get half of them. And you don't
Okay.
get all your genes from your mother, you get half of them. So it's 1 half to the generation number. In other words, 3 generations behind, it'll be N1 is 3. 4 generations common ancestor, N1 will be 4. N2 is the other common ancestor, plus 1, times 1 plus FA, where FA is the common inbred ancestor inbred upon. In other words, when you're inbreeding on inbreds, the effect is cumulative. So what this says is sigma means the sum of. The sum of the inbreeding coefficients times the common ancestor and his inbreeding coefficient. So let's say this is 0.25. So it'll be 1 plus 0.25. So this will be 1.25 times this fraction. So that's what the equation is. And
Okay.
this article uses Arabian stallions, and they go through it through a 9-generation pedigree. Obviously, I'm not going to go through it with you on the phone right now, but
Hmm.
this explains Hardingman, which lived in the year 2000. Well, he's still alive. This was
Oh,
written 22 years ago, Hardingman.
okay.
And Wright wrote the equation in 1922. So that's 78 years difference between this gentleman and this gentleman. And you have to understand the earlier equation written in 1922 before you calculate and understand Hardingman. And of course, and I'll share the next screen very briefly, and then I'll stop sharing screens. Um, um, so in population genetics, there's something called genetic drift and gene flow.
Hmm.
So let's say you have a caribou which left his herd and traveled to a different herd, and he mated with all the females in that herd, and he now changes the genetics of that herd. And this shows you how the frequency of allele pairs change over time, over the number of generations involved,
Hmm.
or this could apply to human genetics. Let's say you have Spanish sailors which traveled with Columbus and other explorers like Ponce de Leon. They hit the US shore, and we have American Indians which lived on these shores at that time. And the sailors of the Spanish fleet married the local Indian women and changed their population genetics. If you look at people in Brazil, we have the gene flow of multiple ethnic groups and racial groups affecting the local population, and that's what gene flow is about.
Hmm.
So, what's an example of that in dogs? If you look at the German Shepherd between East Germany and West Germany, is an example.
Hmm.
So, Germany fell in 1945 at the end of World War II, when Nazi Germany and the Reichstag was captured by the Red Army and the American Army, and it was divided into East and West Germany from 1945 until 1989. In 1961, the Berlin Wall went up, and so there was a physical barrier between East Germany and West Germany. You had communist East Germany and capitalist West Germany, called the FRG, the Federal Republic of Germany, and the East Germany called the DDR, the Deutsche Democratic Republic. Now, 45 years is not a lot of time in human terms,
Yeah.
because a human being, a 40-year-old man can have a 20-year-old son. So in human beings, 40 years is 2 generations,
Hmm.
because our time to reach sexual maturity is age 18, 16. But you don't usually have kids at 16. That's the exception. But let's say, for argument's sake, people marry younger like they did in earlier times,
Hmm.
for the sake of conversation. It is very possible for a 40-year-old man to have a 20-year-old son. It's not without the realm of possibilities. So, can you have a lot of different generations on only 40 years in human beings? The answer is no. It's only 2 populations, 2 generations. But in dogs, a dog, not that I would do it, but a dog can be bred as young as 1 year of age.
Hmm.
It reaches sexual maturity. So a 1-year-old dog can have puppies out of that dog. Now that's breeding too young, but that's not my point. Can you do it? The answer is you
Yeah.
could. So in 45 years, that's 45 generations. So 45 in human beings is not a long time. But in dogs, 45 years is 45 generations. It is a long time.
Yeah.
So when you consider the fact Sorry about that.
Just
When you consider the fact that um, Captain Max von Stefanitz, which founded the German Shepherd in 1899, by 1922 the breed was complete. Howard von Graffith was the first German Shepherd. He bred them to his own daughters to increase the prepotency of the outcome. I'll explain prepotency in a second. Now, from 1899 till 1922, the breed was complete. So it was within his lifetime. So in 23 years, the German Shepherd was finalized. In other words, it wasn't finalized at the beginning of the breed in 1899. It was finalized in 1922. Captain Max von Stefanitz lived until 1935, before the beginning of World War II. So 2 years after the end of World War, 4 years after World War I, 1918, when World War I ended, by 1922, the German Shepherd breed was finalized. So it took 22 years. So getting back to my example of generations, in 22 years, the breed was created. So don't you think the breed can be changed in 45 years?
oh yeah,
which is double the time.
right.
So essentially, because of genetic drift, getting back to that article I pointed to, the separation of communist East Germany from Western West Germany, and that wall, which was put up in 1961, physically dividing them, the East German Shepherd became actually a separate breed. Now, some people will say, well, it's a different breed subtype. Then it gets back to what is a breed? Because we have to define what a breed is. There's something called taxonomy, where animals are classified into species and subspecies, genus and subgenus, if you go back to biology. Now, there's no such thing as breed in taxonomy. Breed is a human invention. In other words, Canis lupus familiaris is the dog, and Canis lupus for Romanian or Italian for wolf. Well, Latin, but Italian and Latin are very close still. Well, it means familiaris, familiar wolf. So dogs and wolves can interbreed. Are they a different species? No, they're the same species, and dogs are a subspecies of wolf. Basically, what it's saying is genetically, wolves and dogs are not different, and it can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So our concept of breed, it doesn't even rise to the level of subspecies in taxonomy. So breed really means an animal with the same physical characteristics that fit the definition with a closed stud book. Well, let's look at that for a second. Okay. In East Germany, you had a separate stud book from West Germany. It was a closed stud book only specific to East Germany. So the SV, the Verrichtschufferhund, which is the German Shepherd Felix Society, in other words, the breed parent club of the German Shepherd, which was started by Captain Max von Stefanitz, that breed book was separated when Germany fell apart. So dogs registered in West Germany were registered in a separate breed book from East Germany. So you have a separate breed book. So these dogs cannot mix with these dogs. They're forbidden from mixing. As the Germans say, verboten. So that's a separate breed.
Yeah.
Because if you don't mix the blood back and forth, and there's no genetic drift, that's a separate breed. So it starts off as the same breed, the German Shepherd, and you can still recognize it's the same breed. But purely by definition, the East German Shepherd and the West German Shepherd became two breeds. The same thing with the American show line, the ones with the crooked back and they're posed with their paw back.
Oh, yeah.
It's a horrible thing what they did. But that dog is supposed to look straight when you put the paw forward. But when the dog's standing, even with the leg straight, it's still at an angle and it walks on its hocks. Now, is the American show line a German Shepherd? Well, according to the AKC, it is. You could take a German dog out of Germany, and you could take an American show line, and by the AKC breed standard, it's the same breed. In reality, it's a different breed. It should be called the American Shepherd because there's no genetic mixing of American show lines with West German working lines. So these two gene pools are completely isolated by the Atlantic Ocean. And therefore, they're a separate breed.
Right.
By the definition of what a breed is.
Yeah. So how far are they different phenotypically?
Very different. So On my website, if you go to vangantahouse.com/articles, I'll bring up that very quickly on my website
Okay.
just for people to see.
Yes, sir. And let me ask this while you're getting that. And even if they were close phenotypically, they still would be different dogs,
Yes,
genotype.
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. So if you look at I'm bringing it up now. Does it come across?
Yeah, I see it. I'm looking at it
All right.
right
So
now.
here's an American showline in 1970. Look
Yeah,
at this male, for example. Here's an
yeah.
example on the right. Now, in German Shepherds, males and females are distinctly separate. You have distinctly masculine traits and distinctly feminine traits.
Mm-hmm.
This is a male. He looks like a female.
Yeah.
Compare this dog. Let me find a good example. Here, to compare this dog.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an East German Shepherd. Okay.
Yeah.
You could tell this is a male.
Yeah. He like a male.
Big mane, heavy bone structure. You see the heavy bone structure?
Mm-hmm.
Very masculine, square head. He looks masculine without even knowing it's a male, right? You know it's a male.
Right.
Now you look at the American showline. Here's an American showline male. You can see the male portion here.
Yeah. Yeah.
He looks like a female.
Mm-hmm.
Narrow muzzle, no mane, long stretched neck, no squareness of the jaw. You
Mm-hmm.
can't tell this is a male or female by looking at him.
Right.
That's just in secondary sex characteristics. That's one problem. Problem number two, look at the dog's back leg. He's walking on his hocks. Now,
Mm-hmm.
so this is an American showline versus now. Here's a West German showline. Notice the roach back. Notice the West German working line. Straight back,
Mm-hmm.
square. Not perfectly square. The Malinois is perfectly square. The German Shepherd's supposed to have a little bit of slope,
Yeah.
not completely no slope. The Malinois is completely square. The German Shepherd is not,
Mm-hmm.
because you have a longer ratio this way, left top to bottom, than this way, from the shoulder to the. Now, you could tell this is a classic German Shepherd. This
Mm-hmm.
is a modern invention,
Yeah.
which is no longer looks like a German Shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an example of a West German working line. You could tell it's a male. This is a West German show line. Now I'm going to go into there's still some standards they follow, but not to the same degree. Here's an East German dog or a Czech dog. You see, distinctly masculine, square head, heavier bone construction, as you can see, heavier build, much stronger muscles in the shoulder muscle, as you can see. And you could tell it's a dog bred for a purpose. So even without inbreeding or line breeding, let me stop. That I stopped that screen, or it's still
Yeah.
showing?
Yeah. No, it's gone.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
Yes.
All right. So now, before we talk about line breeding and inbreeding, first we talked about gene pools. So when a gene pool becomes isolated and is bred for a specific purpose, it becomes a separate gene pool of the breed at large. So let's talk about that.
Okay.
At the end of World War I, the Heritage Foundation for the Blind needed people to walk the blind. So they bought 100 German Shepherds from Germany. Now remember, Germany was an enemy country after World War I.
Yes.
So the British renamed them Alsatian, not to call them Germans. But they're German Shepherds, but the British call them Alsatians.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, that's a whole different,
Gotcha.
that's a historical fact. Anyhow, they brought 100 dogs, and they were expensive for that time period. They hired 4 trainers, paid them salaries, gave them housing, and they had them train the dogs to lead a blind person. Now, the training methods were crude for that time, but they were the training methods of that time. In other words, the method was the same across all these dogs. Whether it was the ideal training method or not the ideal training method, that's besides the point. It was what it was, but it was consistent across all these animals. Now, you couldn't take a chance that a dog which is not suitable would lead a blind person and get that person killed by a car. And you have to have a reliable dog that can lead a blind person. Well, out of 100 dogs that they trained for a year and a half, 100 dogs Guess how many dogs succeeded out of 100?
How many?
3.
Woo.
97% failure rate.
Damn.
Now, they pay the salary of these trainers and housing and food for 2 years for these trainers. They pay the cost of the dogs and to feed them and take care of them for 2 years.
Mm,
97 dogs. Remember how much money is involved.
mm-hmm.
Couldn't do the job that they were brought in for. So a person buys a German Shepherd, they say, well, a German Shepherd is a German Shepherd. They're all the same. I just want a pet. Really? Now, when they bred these 3 dogs to each other, guess how many were successful in the next generation?
I would
All
say,
of them.
yeah, I was going to say a
All of them.
significant amount more. Okay, good.
Right.
Yeah.
All of them.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it was 87%, but the next generation was 100%.
Good.
But what I'm saying is, when you take dogs which already exhibit the right traits and those genetics then pass on to the next generation, your success rate for the task at hand increases.
Mm-hmm.
So if I took those very same dogs which were successful for leading a blind person, which is a very compliant animal, it's not a high drive animal,
Yeah.
right? Now I want these dogs to do police work and take down a criminal. Now I'm going to have the opposite effect.
Right.
These dogs will fail.
Yeah. Right.
But if I take a dog from Schutzen lines or IGP lines and I make them take down a man with training, obviously, with a bite suit or a bite sleeve,
Mm-hmm.
how many of those from the Schutzen lines will succeed? A lot.
Lot. Yeah.
Because they have a high prey drive and they have enough aggression to take on an opponent. So here's the same breed, German Shepherd, but here were dogs which were selectively taken to breed leading blind people, and here are dogs which were taken to do bite work in a dog sport. Now, the same breed, but are you breeding the breed or are you breeding based on the characteristics of the specific dogs involved?
Mm-hmm.
You're breeding in the specific characteristics of the dogs involved.
Mm-hmm.
So even without inbreeding or line breeding, which I'll get to in a minute, you're still able to homogenize the traits you want because you're selecting animals from a sub-gene pool specific to that task.
Mm.
So let's say I'm getting a Belgian Malinois, which I'm not going to recommend for most people because they can't handle it. Now, and that Belgian Malinois comes from KNPV lines. KNPV is the Royal Dutch Police Dog Sport. Now, it's bred generation after generation to bite people on the bite suit. Now you take it into the average suburban home and you want it to watch TV with you when you finish work and you're exhausted from driving and being at work for 8 hours. You now have a 10-hour day, and this dog is pent up and wants to do something. Now, that's the wrong dog for that family. Now, you give this dog to a professional trainer or a military purpose, it's the right dog.
Mm-hmm.
So now, let's say I take a Belgian Malinois and its close cousin, the Groendel, which is a cousin of the Belgian Malinois, or a Touverain, which is another cousin. Now, they're not bred for KNPV. They're bred to be sheepdogs or pets. Now, it's the same breed, essentially. It's just a difference in coat type, essentially. I mean, you have a black Malinois or a wire coat, it's the same breed.
Yeah.
Now, just a difference in type, right? Now, color does not make a breed. So, to me, the Touverain, the Groendel, and the Belgian Malinois, they're all the same breed, just different coat types and color. Okay, versus fawn versus black. That doesn't make a breed. Color does not make a breed. Now, but it's not the coat type that was the difference, or the fact that it's called Groendel. You should just call it Belgian sheepdog, right?
Right.
And it would be a fairer term to use that term, right? Now, will that dog work in the average household? The answer is yes, because it was selectively bred not to be so hyper for bite work. It was bred to be more of a pet. So it's not the breed that is the problem. It's the sub-gene pool within the breed that you have to understand when you're selecting for an animal.
Gotcha.
Even if you don't line breed or inbreed to concentrate traits, just by selecting the sub-gene pool involved, you are therefore selection criteria testing the kind of animal you get. So dog sports have a big influence on genetics. So where did it all come from? Well, getting back to Captain Max von Stefanitz, the founder of the breed, the German Shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
He created a sport called Schutzhund. In German, Schutzmann means policeman. Schutzhund, Hund means hound or dog.
Gotcha.
And Schutz means police. So Schutzhund means protection dog, to be translated word for word, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the German Shepherd in German is the Deutscher Schäferhund, the German sheepdog. That's the exact translation,
Mm-hmm.
word for word. Now, so the Deutscher Schäferhund, that is the breed in German, is a generic utility breed. It's not designed for police work. That's how they're used, but that's not what it was designed for. It was designed to be a utility breed. Now, you then create a dog sport called Schutzhund, which is tracking, protection, and obedience. It's a 300-point scale. 100 points for obedience. Perfect score is 100 points.
Mm-hmm.
100 points for tracking. 100 points for obedience. So protection, tracking, and obedience. So let's say you take a dog which scored 97 in tracking, 85 in obedience, and 250 in tracking. Now, there's a judge, which is an impartial arbiter of the dog's abilities. It's not because you love the dog and you want to breed it. No, you've taken the dog to some kind of a standard
Mm-hmm.
judged by a neutral arbiter, which scores the dog in a trial of other dogs, which are doing the exact same task, tracking, obedience, and protection. And this neutral arbiter decides the score of the dog and which dogs pass and which dogs fail. So just like in nature, the strongest survive, survival of the fittest.
Mm-hmm.
In the German Shepherd, Schutzen is the arbiter of which dogs get to breed or not breed. So, so Captain Max von Stefanitz knew he will die. Obviously, all of us are not going to live forever.
That's right.
And one of the things he did, which was very smart, was he created a test that can be used to train dogs to that standard, and then dogs which pass the standard breed, and dogs which fail the standard don't breed. And therefore, he created a modicum of, now it's subject to interpretation and human error is involved. It's subjective, but at the very least, there's a standard. Now, other working breeds, the Rottweiler, the Doberman, the Bassaron, there are a lot of other working breeds, also now do IGP. But originally, this test was designed for the German Shepherd. It was first designed for the German Shepherd. Other
Mm-hmm.
breeds now do it, but it's not. It was originally for the German Shepherd. Now, by using this standard, a dog sport, as an arbiter of which dogs breed or don't breed, you're selection testing dogs. So so your selection pressure in nature, the selection pressure, which let's say you have a deer and it cannot outrun the wolf, it will be killed and eaten, right?
Right.
So if you don't have enough speed, you don't get to survive because you'll
That's
be
right.
eaten. Or the wolf which cooperates in a pack, and one wolf runs ahead and grabs the deer by the throat while the pack rushes in from behind. That wolf, which has that ability to cut off the animal so the whole herd, so the whole pack feeds, that wolf is exhibiting the right characteristic for the hunt. So he'll survive.
Mm-hmm.
But a wolf which cannot run and keep up with the pack doesn't get to participate in the kill.
Right.
He won't eat and he will not survive and pass on his genes.
Mm-hmm.
So in nature, you have a mechanism, survival of the fittest. So nature exerts selection pressure, but we are human beings. We decide which animals get bred or don't bred.
Mm-hmm.
Not nature decides. So you have natural selection, which is nature, and artificial selection, which is people. And we decide which dogs get bred and don't bred. Well, what's your selection criteria?
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you're breeding greyhounds, as an example, which ones do you breed? The fastest ones.
Mm-hmm.
You have a clock. It's pretty neutral. You time the dog going around a race course, and that clock doesn't lie, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whichever one ran the fastest, that's the one you breed.
That's right.
How do you breed thoroughbreds? Whichever one ran fastest, that's the one you breed. The
Mm-hmm.
horse which constantly can't run, you don't breed that horse,
Right.
right? So you
Mm-hmm.
need a yardstick of some kind. Now, if you're breeding a non-performance breed, like a Yorkie or I don't know, the lab breeds, the small little
Yeah.
Chihuahuas,
Yeah.
who cares? Because they're, I don't mean to sound negative about other breeds, but
Right.
I work with a performance breed.
Yeah.
So you need a performance standard by which you breed. So by creating this sport, you're creating a sub-gene pool of working dogs out of the gene pool at large, which does not include working dogs.
Mm-hmm.
And that gene pool was selectively tested that even if you breed unrelated dogs, but from Schutzen lines, the characteristics the dog exhibits to pass that test is similar, not identical.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates your selection criteria. So this idea of creating a test, which will then be used by which you selection test dogs, that idea came from cavalry horses because Captain Max von Stephanitz was a cavalry officer in the Prussian army. Remember, Germany didn't exist in the 19th century. You had Prussia. You didn't have Germany. You had German kingdoms, but they were not united as a country.
Gotcha.
So he created, being an ex-cavalry officer, he knew horse breeding. So he applied that logic to dogs and created a test called Schutzhund. And let's say you want a dog which is good for weight pulling. You pull on a strap on the dog, a harness, and you make it weight pull. The muscles are exercised, and the dog which is strongest muscular wise can pull weight. Then you breed those dogs together. Well, genetically, they're going to drift toward a common goal, which is stronger musculature, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, you need a test of some kind that will rule out the weakest from the strongest.
Mm-hmm.
And even without lion breeding or inbreeding, you have a selection criteria.
The dogs need to be proven before.
Proven by some method.
Yeah.
In other words, if you're hog hunting,
Mm-hmm.
let's say, the dog which backs out and runs away, that's a cur. That's a dog which is afraid and will fight for itself, but will not fight for you, right?
Right.
Do you breed that dog? No.
Mm-hmm.
That dog in combat demonstrated fear.
Yeah.
The dog which goes for it and kills that hog,
Mm-hmm.
or tries to, that
Yeah.
dog is showing courage and he has
Right.
tenacity in the fight, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is, whatever the breed involved, I'm going all over the place between game dogs and German Shepherds and Malinois,
Yeah.
but I'm explaining the concept. There has to be some neutral arbiter of some kind of a test by which you will create a subgene pool within the breed at large, which get to be bred or not bred.
Let
That's
me
what
ask
I'm
you
trying
this.
to explain.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Alex. Is that why it has been so much of a mass importation for European countries because of a higher breeding standard?
Correct.
Okay.
In Germany, unlike the US, in the US, any AKC dog can be bred to any AKC dog. You could have a dog with an overbite, underbite, crooked hocks, easty westy limbs, which are like this way.
Mm-hmm.
You can breed them. Why? Because they both have AKC papers, so that's sufficient. Because the AKC is a registry of pure bloodedness, but it doesn't mean the dogs have. It doesn't mean because the both dogs have AKC papers that you should breed them. It simply means they are both purebred, that they are members of that breed. But are they the best representatives of that breed? The answer is no, because there's no yardstick. Now in Germany and other European countries, a German Shepherd needs a Schutzen title, which is now called IGP. They keep renaming it IGP. It previously was called IPO. Before that, it was called Schutzen. So I'm an old timer. I still say Schutzen.
Yes, sir.
So so um, so now a male has to have at least a Schutzen one, and a female has to have a Schutzen one. It doesn't have to be a national level competitor. It could be a local club trial,
Right.
but they still have to be titled. Then you have to have what's called a hip X-ray, called an A stamp, where the hip socket is aligned into the hip joint properly. The other part of it, because remember, X-rays came out only in the 1890s, and Captain Max von Stephanitz lived in 1859. So the ability to X-ray for animals, uh, X-rays were expensive. They were only used for humans.
Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Roentgen, who invented the X-ray, it was by happenstance he invented the X-ray, by the way. But that's beside the point. In other words, the luxury of X-raying animals didn't come until the 20th century.
Okay.
But Schutzen came as a test in the 19th century, 100 years ago. So how did you test hip X-rays for dogs without having, it would be, in other words, it would have been cost prohibitive to X-ray a dog in the 19th century. Even humans couldn't get X-rays for
Right.
medical purposes in the 19th century.
Yeah.
We're talking about 150 years ago, right? 120, depending on which time period you're discussing, right? So
Yeah.
it was cost prohibitive to X-ray dogs that long ago. I mean, we can do it now easily. in the
Hmm.
present day. But in 19th century, nobody would X-ray dogs to determine if they have hip dysplasia, right? Because it was just cost prohibitive to do X-rays even for people, never mind dogs. Only the very rich could afford X-rays,
Hmm.
going back in time. So how did dogs get tested? Well, back then, what did they do? They had a wall straight up. Now they use an A-frame where the dog runs up the A-frame and then it runs down the A-frame. But
Hmm.
originally they had a straight wall. And the dog had to jump up and climb that straight wall, and then on the way down it had a triangular piece, so it wouldn't hurt itself. Now they still do that with the Malinois, or they make them jump a broad jump over distance. And if you don't have the right orthopedics, you can't do the jump.
Mm.
They also would do what's called the AD. I don't know what the word is in German, top of my head, but it's basically the dog runs next to a man on a bicycle for 10 kilometers. And you can't have bad hips and run 10 kilometers.
Hmm.
It's just not possible because
Right.
you would hurt too much.
Right.
So before the dog gets core class by a core meister, which is a breed warden,
Hmm.
the dog first has a Schützen title and then gets an AD where they run 10 kilometers besides a man on the bicycle. And then once the dog has an AD and has a Schützen title, then it goes in front of a judge called a core meister or a breed warden.
Hmm.
And then it gets core class SG, sehr gut, KKL2, acceptable for breeding, KKL1, highly recommended for breeding.
Mm.
And so when
That.
they say a dog has pink papers, what they mean is the dog has been core classed and Schützen titled. That's what pink papers mean in German
Okay.
Shepherds.
Okay.
So basically, and it's a dog born in Germany, obviously, not somewhere else. So now, so without X-rays, because X-rays, as I said, started becoming popular in the 20th century, it was cost prohibitive in the 19th century. But the physical act of running for 10 kilometers, if you have bad hips, you can't do it. So that's how he got around not having X-rays.
Yeah.
He couldn't have predicted X-ray machines would have been invented, right? I mean,
Mhm.
he bought the dog in 1899, 1 year before the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, right? So now he couldn't have predicted X-rays would be invented, and he
Mhm.
couldn't have predicted living in 1899 that X-rays would be common, that it would be so cost effective to do X-rays for dogs that anybody could do it. Living in 1899, how could you foresee X-rays being used for dogs?
Yeah.
You can't, right? But he knew that with the wrong hips, you can't run and you
Yeah.
can't jump.
Right.
So, so the test of Schützen existed before X-rays did, and the physical act of running and jumping a wall meant only the strongest dogs with the best legs and the best hips could then be bred. So that's a real practical way of testing for bad hips.
Mm.
And hip dysplasia is so common in the German Shepherd that this test is actually very necessary. Now, in
Right.
the American breed, there is no such standard, none. So if I buy a dog out of Europe, the dog had to do all this stuff before it gets to be bred.
Hmm.
Now there's selection testing involved. So there's some kind of a process in place. In America, purebred male, purebred female, you breed them, you make puppies, you make money.
Yeah.
That's not a standard.
Hmm.
And that's why people import. I import dogs from Holland and from, like my bitch Bailey, she was from Netherlands.
Right.
She's the daughter of Karel van Brandenburg, the KNPB champion,
Right.
who's the son of Yukon van Perot, the three-time Bundesprogen champion.
Hmm.
So she comes from a line of dogs which passed a lot of work to get titled to that level. So she has superior genetics. My dog Jake was from Born van Volsri, also imported from Germany. He passed. Jake passed also, unfortunately. But
Mm.
Jake was the grandson of Yukon van Perot. So same grandfather, two different fathers. In other words, Bailey and Jake produced a 3-3 line breeding on Yukon, common grandfather. So they're first cousins.
Okay.
So same grandpapa.
Right.
Um, so basically, that's why I breed European born dogs, because not every dog in my kennel is obviously born in Europe,
Hmm.
but they're descended from dogs either one generation or only two generations removed from a European blood.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Sorry for that detailed explanation,
No. No. No.
but I
No.
thought that was important.
Yeah. Yeah. It was. Something you touched on earlier. You said it was difference in breeding birds, reptiles, dogs. What are some of the main differences in mammals and birds and things like that?
Well, I'm not a geneticist, so I'm not gonna tell you that I'm a geneticist.
Right.
But you have to understand that there's a couple of different. You have to cover a couple of definitions first before I explain it.
Okay.
So the first definition is what is called autosomal gene pairs. So let's say you have an X and Y chromosome, the sex chromosomes, but all the other chromosomes are called autosomal chromosomes from your parents.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, let's say you have 78 chromosomes. One is X or Y, the sex gender chromosome, but 77 are other chromosomes. They're called autosomal chromosomes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in genes, there's something called gene recombination. So what does that mean? Let's say I'm going to make an analogy to, I'll make a simple analogy, which is kind of oversimplifying it, but it gets the idea across. Imagine you have a fruit bowl of cut up fruit. You have 16 apple slices, 16 banana slices, and 16 watermelon slices, just for the hell of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the mother's fruit bowl. And you have the father's fruit bowl, which is 16 pear slices, not apple,
Mm-hmm.
16 peach slices, and 16 strawberries. Just
Yeah.
picture this in your mind.
Right.
Now, you take fruit from the father's bowl and you take fruit from the mother's bowl. And let's say you get 4 apple slices and 4 banana slices, no matter what. Let's say. So, brother and sister, or brother and brother, siblings, will have some of the exact same genes all the time because
Mm-hmm.
they come from the same 2 parents.
Mm-hmm.
But in brother 1, you'll get 14 apple slices, but only 2 banana slices. And in brother 2, from the mother, in other words, gene 1 through 17 in this offspring come from the father, but in the next offspring, his brother or his sister, you'll get gene 2 to 25.
Right.
And the same thing happens from the mother's genes. You get gene 1 through 16 from the female this time around, and gene 18, 22, and 27 in this offspring. Now, in the other broad offspring, which is the exact same parents, you'll get from the father, not genes 1 through 17. This time you're going to get genes 6 through 10 in that offspring. And from the mother, you'll get genes 14 through 19. In other words, it's called gene recombination. In other words, some of them are going to be the same because they're the same 2 parents. But some of them will be a different combination.
Mm-hmm.
So offspring, even though they're brothers and sisters, they're not identical clones of each other.
Right.
Then you would have the identical genes every time.
Mm-hmm.
But in siblings, you'll have gene recombination. In other words, this set of genes from the papa and these chromosomes in this particular child will be these set of genes from this child and that combination. But the base is the same. So some minimum number is always the same chromosomes because it's the same parents. But the other chromosomes will be a different combination every time.
Mm-hmm.
That's called gene recombination. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that only happens in the autosomal chromosomes, not in the sex-linked chromosomes. Now, then there's a different mode of inheritance for the sex-linked chromosomes. The X chromosome carries mitochondrial DNA from the mother dog. So how does the father's mother get involved?
Mm.
So let's say you have a female which is 2XX. The male is XY. She can pass on the X from herself and the X from her mother.
Okay.
But the father can only pass the X from his mother because he passes a Y.
Right.
He's XY.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you have in the child? You have the father's mother and the mother or her mother in the child. But the father can only pass his own mother in his X chromosome because he can only pass one X. The
Mm-hmm.
rest is XY. He passes the Y. So the X in the male came from his mom, not from him.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the female dog is more important than the male because the female dog contributes mitochondrial DNA from herself and her mother. The male can only pass the chromosomes from his mother, not himself.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a male pattern of inheritance where you can do sex-linked genes through the male, and there's a female pattern of inheritance through the female. Now, the female can pass two X's, not one. So she can have two paths of inheritance. Now, you have autosomal DNA and sex-linked DNA with two different paths of inheritance through the male line versus the female line. Now, in mammals, you can trace a lineage through the Y chromosome or the mitochondrial chromosome.
Mhm.
So let's say human beings, you could determine that these people are from Yemen and they're Yemenites, as opposed to Jews or Arabs, through the Y chromosome. Because these men fathered these children from that geographical location.
Gotcha. Okay.
Now, how do you know these are Yemenites? Through the Y chromosome. How do you know these are Italians, not Greeks? Through the Y chromosome. So nationality, which is the equivalent of a breed in human beings. So this overlaps, believe it or not.
Mm-hmm.
So the word nationality means nation, and the people of a specific nation are a specific gene pool, which is closed off to other gene pools originally. I mean, before the invention of the bicycle, people married somebody in their village. People
Right.
didn't travel that far. So now with jet aircraft, people can take gene populations from across the globe and intermarry. So the concept of race will disappear in 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to have the black race, the white race, and the Asian race. You're going to have one race. The concept of race, of black, white, and yellow race will disappear because of the ability to intermarry and gene flow across the globe because of jet travel.
Right.
And intermarriage is now accepted.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier, intermarriage was not accepted.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to stray too far from dogs, but
Yeah.
it's the same concept.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so the idea of marriage within a small circle, or your village or your community, was how nationalities developed. Because
Mm-hmm.
people within that close geographical location became a nationality. That's why people from Asia look the same, or people from Greece look the same. Now it's the 21st century, so people are free to travel and race it. Even in earlier times, when the Spanish was invaded by the Moors,
Mm-hmm.
and during the time before the Spanish Inquisition,
Right.
you had the Moors invade Spain. You had
Yeah.
dark-skinned people invade a mostly white nation. Spaniards are not the white race anymore because the Moors invaded Spain in the 11th century.
Mm-hmm.
Gene flow, right? That's an
Right.
example of gene flow.
Right.
Same thing with dogs. What is a race of dogs? The German Shepherd. It's dogs which only breed with other German Shepherds,
Mm-hmm.
not other dogs. Or you have the Cane Corso. It only breeds with Cane Corsos.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't breed with Rottweilers. So you have a closed gene pool within a certain area, and other breeds cannot mix in. So the idea of a nationality and the degree of a breed, it's the same concept,
Gotcha. Mm-hmm.
right? Now, how do you trace the lineage of a nationality? Through the Y chromosome. Now, so getting back to your question, mammalian genetics versus bird genetics, the principle of inbreeding and line breeding is the same. So if I breed uncle to aunt, or I breed full siblings, which again, I'm not recommending these things, I'm just explaining.
Mm-hmm.
Um, these concepts of relationship, of who is who relative to who, like these are first cousins because they have a common grandparent. That concept transcends birds, reptiles, or animals. Uncle and a niece are uncle and a niece, whether I'm breeding chickens or I'm breeding dogs. That concept is the same. The inbreeding coefficient would be mathematically the same, but because of gene recombination and the greater number of chromosomes and the complexity of passing traits through the sex-linked chromosomes, not just through the autosomal chromosomes, mammals can't take the degree of inbreeding that birds can. Birds can take a greater degree of inbreeding without showing deleterious traits. In other words, you can inbreed pretty far in birds before you see disease. And
Mm-hmm.
also in birds, if you don't like the outcome, you kill the chicken and you eat
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
it. It's not that
I'm
bad
gonna give
that
me
you
some
can,
chicken.
yeah, you can eat the chicken and okay, it's not good enough for breeding. Let's
Yeah.
kill it and we have chicken soup today.
Right.
So so in birds you can inbreed further, and if you don't like the results, you can eat the bird and no problem. So birds and reptiles can inbreed further and deeper over more generations without suffering bad consequences. Mammals can't. You have to outcross much sooner to get back what's called heterostasis. Um, what does that mean? Um, People need to understand two terms: homozygous genes and heterozygous genes.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? The word hetero means different. The word homo means the same.
Mm-hmm.
And then the word zygosous, heterozygosity, it comes from the word zygote. What is a zygote? When the sperm meets the egg, that's a zygote. It's
Okay.
not an embryo yet. An embryo is implanted and becomes a child. But at the instant a sperm hits the egg, that's called a zygote.
Okay.
It's the act of conception where the DNA of the mother and the father
Meat. Okay.
meet. That's
Okay.
called a zygote in
Mm-hmm.
biology. Now, it's the fertilized egg. It's not yet an embryo. It'll become an embryo in a few weeks, but it's not an embryo at that instant of time. Now, so homozygosity, zygote comes from the word, uh, embryo means, and hetero means different, and homo means the same. So homozygous gene pairs means the genes line up between mother and father, and they are the exact same genes on both sides. Therefore, you've concentrated those traits, and the animal's prepotent. In other words, it'll pass those traits 100% of the time because you've concentrated those genes.
Mm-hmm.
Heterozygous genes means that's different genes. So between different genes from mother and father, combined with gene recombination, you have hybrid vigor.
Right.
So mammals can't take the degree of inbreeding that birds can
Mm-hmm.
because of these reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a deeper explanation, I'm not a geneticist, so I
Right.
leave it up to the audience to research that. But basically, the concepts of inbreeding and line breeding are the same because relationships are relationships. Cousins are cousins, grandparents are grandparents. Those concepts remain the same across birds and reptiles and people. It's all the same concept.
Mm-hmm.
But how far can you take mammalian inbreeding versus bird inbreeding? It's very different. So it's not the same. There's
Gotcha.
greater risk in inbreeding mammals than birds
Right. Right.
by
Is
far.
there so in every breed though that's been made into a breed, there was some
Inbreeding.
form of inbreeding.
It
Yeah.
had to be done to create a breed in the first place, so you couldn't do it.
Right. Right. And so the formula the COI, every breeder kind of needs that in this toolbox you recommend.
Correct. So let's explain the COI versus the COR.
Okay.
The coefficient of relationship is the genetic distance between the two animals involved.
Mm-hmm.
For example, let's say I breed a father to his own daughter,
Mm-hmm.
which is done initially to create a breed. The offspring of that mating is 75% COR. As the father of that puppy, he's 50% of the genes, but he's also the grandfather because he's the father of his own daughter. That's 25%. So you have 50% plus 25% is 75%. So the coefficient of relationship is 75%. But what's the coefficient of inbreeding? It's roughly a quarter of that. So a quarter of 75 is 25.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you have two first cousins mating, as an example. The easiest way to do it, which is very simple, is take 1/2 to the power of the distance of the relative. So if it's a grandfather, he's 3 generations away from you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your parent is you. You're counting yourself as 1.
Yeah.
Your parent is 2.
Two.
His parent is 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
So 1/2 to the cubed, 1/2 cubed,
Mm-hmm.
because it's the mother's grandfather. And on the father's side, it's the same grandfather. So it's 1/2 also cubed.
Mm-hmm.
1/2 cubed plus 1/2 cubed is 1/8 plus 1/8, which is 2/8. 2/8 is 1/4.
Mm-hmm.
1/4 is 25%. So a common grandfather has a coefficient of inbreeding, coefficient of relationship of 25%.
Mm-hmm.
What's the coefficient of inbreeding? 1/4 of a quarter, because the inbreeding coefficient is 25%. Go back to a fraction versus a percent. Whatever way you like to do it, you can do it.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever you like to do, the way you do the fractions, it doesn't
Right.
matter.
Yeah.
Okay. So a quarter of a quarter. So a quarter times a quarter is 1/16. 1/16 is 6.25%. So if the coefficient of relationship is 25%, the coefficient of inbreeding is 6.25%, 1/4 of the coefficient of relationship. Now, what does that mean? Well, the first thing you have to understand is what is the coefficient of inbreeding mathematically versus, like, say, I do a pedigree-based COI. I go to pedigreedatabase.com.
Yeah.
I put in a father, I put in a mother, and I get a hypothetical coefficient of inbreeding between these two dogs, right? Or I use a program called BreedMate. You can buy a copy of breedmate.com. You can buy a copy of a database which will do this calculations for you.
Okay.
I want to do it that, these are all available software. And there's other software. Now, I did my girl Lucy, one of my females I kept out of Jake and Bailey. According to the Embark blood test, she has a 30% coefficient of inbreeding. But according to Pedigree database, she has a 6.25% coefficient of inbreeding. So which is right, the blood work one or the pedigree one, which is the right one? Well, the blood work one is the right one because the actual inbreeding is what the blood work shows, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this coefficient of inbreeding as tested by Embark vet panel, and as the mathematical coefficient as predicted by Wright's or Hardiman's equation. So he says, wait, why such a big discrepancy? What the hell does that mean? Here's what it means. Let's say I have a litter of 9 pups, as an example, and they have the same grandfather. My example is Jake and Bailey, my 2 dogs which have the same grandfather. I did that. You can order a kit of 9 test kits from Embark. The unit is 9. If you have 10 pups, you got to order a separate kit.
Right.
But you can buy a 9-pack, kit.
Mm-hmm.
Out of my own curiosity, I tested every puppy in that litter because I was curious. One puppy using Embark was 3% coefficient of inbreeding. One pup was 6.25 on the dot. One pup was 17%. Lucy came out 30%. Now remember, the maximum number is 25%.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So there's a variability across the litter mates. Some got more of the homozygous gene pairs, and some got less. So the coefficient of inbreeding is the average over the entire litter,
Oh, gotcha.
not of the specific dog. In other
Gotcha.
words, on average, the breeding will be 6.25% inbreeding coefficient. But that might not be that dog. That might be its litter mate. In other words, I tested the entire litter because I spend the money. Well, who cares?
Mm-hmm.
You want to know what you're going to do, right?
Yeah.
Now, some came in. No, it wasn't 30%. It was 25%. My bad. My memory's playing tricks on me now.
Okay.
So the coefficient of breeding can reach as high as the coefficient of relationship. That's the upper range. In other words, up to 25% of all the genes are the same.
Mm-hmm.
But it's typically a quarter of the maximum number for the litter as a whole. So one puppy came in at 3%, one puppy with the Embark test. Now, mathematically, they're all 6.25%.
Mm-hmm.
But with the Embark test, one puppy came in at 6.25%, one puppy came at 3%, another puppy came in at 15%, Lucy came in at 25%. That's the one I kept.
Yeah. Okay. 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 Yeah.
In other words, if you're going to do line breeding, you want to get that higher percentage so that the offspring mimics the ancestor you're inbreeding upon.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are going to do line breeding and you want a champion dog, which represents the epitome of that breed, at least in your mind,
Mm-hmm.
or you want to see which pups are closest to his genetics, where that homogeneous combination. Remember, I told you about gene recombination?
Yes, sir.
So that gene recombination did not happen equally across all the offspring.
Right.
That's why the Embark test was different per 9 pups. But the pedigree COI it's a predicted value. It's not the actual value. The actual value is what the saliva test showed. You take a cheek swab, you send it off to them, 2 weeks later, you get a result. That's the actual coefficient of inbreeding by the DNA markers.
Mm-hmm.
That's the real number.
Gotcha.
Pedigree calculation using Sewall's equation or Wright's equation is a predictor of risk of what the average is across the litter. But not every member of the litter will be that number.
Mm-hmm.
That's the average.
Right.
The
Right.
Embark test is the real number using genetic markers. Now remember, they didn't have genetic markers in 1922,
Mm-hmm.
so they
Mm-hmm.
had to have some way of calculating it, and that's where the embark coefficient of inbreeding versus the pedigree coefficient of inbreeding don't quite match. They do match, but on average, not for every member of that litter. That
Right.
people have to understand that.
Right. And so this method, how good is it at holding phenotype?
It's not very good.
Okay.
It's not very good. Um, you would think it would be good,
Mm-hmm.
but actually not very good,
Okay.
which was surprising to me, but that comes from experience. Let me explain.
Okay.
Ideally, well, let's first define it for the audience which doesn't know, because I don't know who the audience is. So let quickly take a second to define it.
Mm-hmm.
Phenotype is breeding a dog by how they look. Genotypes is having common ancestors, and it's in the genes. So let's say I want to create a very consistent litter, and I can do that by breeding by similar phenotype. Let's say I want a black German Shepherd. That's my ideal. I'll take a black bitch to a black stud, and I'll create black pups.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm breeding them, they look similar. They look color-wise the same. Or I'll take a dog with a heavy musculature, or I'll take a dog with a light skeletal structure, let's say, and I breed to another dog with a light skeletal structure. They look the same anatomically and color-wise, so I'm breeding by phenotype. I'm breeding like to like because they
Mm-hmm.
look similar. Now, will the pups look similar? Yeah, because the parents look similar. But can that pass into the next generation? The answer is it can't. Now, they will look similar, but their temperament will be all over the place. Completely different
Mm,
temperaments.
yeah.
Very different.
Mm-hmm.
Because temperament characteristics like prey drive, aggression, intelligence, that's inherited by genotype, not by phenotype.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way somebody looks, that's how they look.
Yeah.
Now, so let's take my first litter that I have with Bailey and Jake. Jake was a black and tan dog. Bailey's a sable dog. Jake was a heavy construction, short muzzle, ears far apart, not close like this, but far apart. Heavier jowl structure. Bailey had a very long muzzle. Ears are closer together. She has a different top line than Jake did. She has a deep, round chest, a barrel chest, like her father.
Mm-hmm.
Her anatomy is like just like her father.
Mm-hmm.
Jake did not look like her even close. Now, how did the puppies come out? Well, in terms of color, we had some black and tan, some sable with a black and tan saddle. We had puppies which had Jake's body structure, heavier boned and heavier in the front and in the back. Some had Bailey structure, like a very gazelle-like, very light bone structure. So um, they were all over the place in terms of how they looked, even though they're all bred from first cousins. Now, so what's the ideal? The ideal is to breed by genotype and by phenotype,
Mm.
if you can do it.
Right.
So had they looked similar and were first cousins, now you're really emphasizing repeatable traits. Now, in my second litter and my third litter, I bred Bailey. Jake passed away from cancer, unfortunately. I love that dog.
Mm. Sorry.
But yeah, Bailey was bred to a dog named Jago, Jago of the Southland. He's on my website. His father is the product of a half brother to half sister mating. So he's the son of a half sibling mating. Same father twice, different moms. So essentially, he is his father.
Mm-hmm.
He has 50% of his genes. Now, which dog is prepotent, Bailey or Jago? Jago. Jago is the product of an inbreeding, not even
Yeah.
a line breeding, a
Right.
true inbreeding.
Mm-hmm.
When I breed Jago to Bailey, who will outpower who? The inbred dog or the non-inbred dog? The inbred dog,
Mm-hmm.
because he's prepotent. What does that mean? If you breed two dogs together, mother and father are 50-50 of the genes. But when this dog has a lot of homogeneous genes lined up through inbreeding or line breeding, he outpowers his female partner. So all the pups came out like baby Jagos
Mm-hmm.
and not like baby Baileys. I mean, to some degree they did.
Right.
I'm not saying she contributed nothing. But what I'm saying is when I inbred, I didn't inbreed. I didn't inbreed at all. I bred a dog which was a product of an inbreeding. He doesn't belong to me. I pay the stud fee. But what I'm saying is, I took a different sire who had inbreeding in him, and I outcrossed him to my female, which is not related to him in the
Hmm.
slightest. Now,
Hmm.
all the pups came out like him. Why? Because he's the product of an inbreeding. So he's therefore prepotent. He passes himself no matter what female he's bred to. I've seen other pups from other people because we're in a small circle of friends which breed dogs together. I belong to a club and we have other German Shepherd people in that club, and I collaborate with other people
Hmm.
because I can't control having so many dogs in my own premises. So I have to use other dogs outside my own program. Otherwise, I'll run out of dogs. So I can't, I don't want to inbreed that heavily. I want to use outside blood. So I work with other people who have their dogs. Now, I've seen other puppies sired by Jago, which other owners have puppies out of him. And no matter what female he's bred to, Czech line, West German show line, he fathered over 120 pups at this point. He got busy.
Yeah. and and he
But
shows
regard,
up a lot in the pups
he
here.
shows up no matter the female he was bred to. Not completely, but heavily. His structure, his temperament, his color, his top line, his hip structure. Now, temperament wise, it's not all, they're all not all the same.
Hmm.
But anatomically, he is a heavy influencer because he's the product of an inbreeding. So a dog which is prepotent, meaning he has a lot of homogeneous genes,
Hmm.
because he's the product of an inbreeding, will outpower his partner. So
Right.
that's what prepotency means. It means you can pass yourself despite being connected to an unrelated dog.
So what does it look like when that happens on both sides, where you have a
Well,
really
that
prepotent
depends.
dog?
Well, that's the whole idea. So that depends on the. So that's not an easy answer. That depends on
Okay.
the amount of inbreeding and the relationship distance of that mother has to that father. For example, let's say the mother is 4 generations away from the father. They have a common great grandfather, not
Hmm.
grandfather, great grandfather, 4 generations away.
Hmm.
If they're both 4 and 4, meaning they're second cousins, not first cousins. First cousins is a common grandparent.
Hmm.
Second cousins is a common great grandparent,
Yeah.
right? Now, so what's the coefficient of relationship? One half to the fourth plus one half to the fourth. 4 generations. One half to the fourth power is 1/16 plus 1/16. That's 2/16, which is 1/8. So the coefficient of relationship is 1/8. What's the coefficient of inbreeding? 1/4 of 1/8, which is 1/32nd.
Hmm.
So the coefficient of inbreeding is only what, 1.56%? Nothing, right?
Right.
Now, what if that same ancestor is 4/4 on the mother and 5/4 on the father? Now he appears not only once in the fourth generation, but twice in the father side and twice now. It's one half to the fifth plus one half to the fourth on this side, and one half to the fourth plus one half to the fourth on this side, and you add the fractions. Remember that Wright's coefficient of inbreeding?
Hmm.
Sigma,
Yeah.
the
Hmm.
sum of the series.
Right. Right.
Sigma means summation in
Okay.
Greek. So basically, you take the relationship distance when that ancestor appears, the common ancestor,
Hmm.
and you take one half to that power and you add it up every time he appears. So let's say he appears 5, 4, 4, 4, 3 fours and 1 5.
Hmm.
It'd be one half to the fourth times 3 plus one half to the fifth. That's the total contribution of that ancestor. Now, so let's say I wanted to line breed in a famous dog, but I don't want to inbreed. I don't want to do close. I don't want to do parent to grandkid, or I mean grandchild to grand parent.
Right.
That's inbreeding. That's not line breeding. Let's say I want to have a common great grandfather. Now, will that create prepotency? The answer is no. Every time you step back in time, you're halving the relationship distance. So as a father, I'm 50% of the genes. As a grandfather, I'm 25% of the genes. As a great grandfather, I'm 12.5% of the genes. As a great 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 grandfather, 5 generations, I'm 6.25% of the genes. So every time I go a generation back, I'm half those genes. Father
Hmm.
50%, grandfather 25%, great grandfather 12.5%, great 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 grandfather 3.25%. In other words, the further back in time, the less the influence. Now,
Right.
but how do you create the influence? You accumulate that grandfather several times in the pedigree, and you add up the coefficient of inbreeding. That's why line breeding is safer than inbreeding, because let's say that ancestor appears 4 times in the 4th generation, let's say, as an example. Now, that one ancestor is 4 times in the 4th generation, so he's 1/2 to the 4th, plus 1/2 to the 4th, plus 1/2 to the 4th, plus 1/2 to the 4th. All right, so that's 1/16 times 4, which is 4/16. 4/16 is what? 1/4, right? 1/4 is 25%. So he's 25% of the genes, but all the other dogs are 75% of the genes.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So now he's 1/4, but you have 4 generations with gene recombination taking place of 75%. In other words, his pedigree is 100% of his genes, right? Of that 100%, 75% are a lot of other dogs, and only 25% is this dog. Whereas with inbreeding, he is a lot and no other dogs involved at all, practically. In other words, by keeping the relationship distance further, he has an influence, but there are a lot of other dogs which have introduced heterozygosity.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
So in a dog which has a coefficient of relationship, not inbreeding, coefficient of relationship of 25%, the other dogs make up the other 75%. And the coefficient of inbreeding is 1/4 of the coefficient of relationship, roughly.
Right.
So 1/4 of 25% is 6.25%. So what's a rough rule of thumb? So anything above 6.25% is considered dangerous. Anything below 6.25% is considered safe. So if a dog has a 5% coefficient of inbreeding, it's safe. If a dog has a 3% coefficient of inbreeding, it's safe. At 6.25%, that's the border between safe and unsafe. Now, let's say you have a cousin, let's say you have an aunt to nephew mating. That's 3-2. 1/2 cubed plus 1/2 squared. She has the female has the same grandfather as the male's father. 1/2 cubed. In other words, her grandfather, 3 generations back, is the male's father, which is 2 generations back. So it's 1/2 cubed plus 1/2 squared. All right, what does that give you? 1/2 cubed is 1/8, plus 1/2 to the square is 1/4. 1/8 plus 1/4 is what? 1/4 is 2/8, so that's 3/8. 3/8 coefficient of relationship. What's the coefficient of inbreeding? 1/4 of 3/8, which is 9.63%. In other words, so an auntie to nephew mating or an uncle to niece mating has a coefficient of relationship of 37.5% and a coefficient of inbreeding of 9.63%. Is this above 6.25%? Yes. But is it below 12.5%, which is half siblings? Yes. So an aunt to nephew mating is below 50% coefficient of relationship. Let's speak in coefficient of relationship. Forget about coefficient of inbreeding because it gets confusing. Let's just talk about coefficient of relationship.
Yeah.
So the same father with 2 different moms, those siblings are 50% of the same father, right? Coefficient of relationship is 50%. What's the coefficient of inbreeding? 12.5%. 1/4 of 50%. 1/4 of 50% is 12.5%. That's dangerous. Now, aunt to nephew is 37.5%, 12.5% lower. First cousins is 6.25%, 3% lower still. So by going from, this dog is 2 generations, but you're taking it 3 generations here, but 2 generations here. You move the generation distance up 1 spot, reducing the risk. So now what does that give you? Well, will you have a prepotent dog? Absolutely. If you look at the Longworth kennel from a breeder named Lloyd Brackett, who invented what's called the bracket formula.
Yeah.
He said, let the sire of the sire be the grandsire of the dam. Let the father's father be the grandfather of the female.
Okay.
That's 2, 3. 1/2 cube plus 1/2 to the cube, the third.
Mm-hmm.
Let the sire of the sire, the father of the sire of the litter, is the grandfather of the female. Now, he produced 90 Ram. Ram is the like the designation of the highest champion in the AKC in the show ring.
Mm-hmm.
Back when they used to do it, I don't know if they still do it, but Ram is like a big champion. I don't know exact word what the word Ram stands for. So he produced 90 Ram dogs. In other words, in Germany, it would be called the Grand Sieger or
Right.
the Grand Siegren if it was like the champion,
Right.
like
Right.
the equivalent of the Westminster Kennel Club dog, but at that time it didn't exist.
Yeah, it's a big deal. Yeah.
The big deal. In other words, the
Yeah.
dog. This is 1940s. We're not talking
Right.
about today. We're talking
Mm-hmm.
about 1940s and 1950s. We're not talking about
He
and
made 90 champions.
90 champions in 10 years
Ooh,
using this formula.
okay. Yeah.
So he invented the prototype. Now, he outcrossed.
Okay.
He didn't keep doing it. Once you do a 3, 2, 3, you must outcross.
Okay.
Because think of it this way: what is this dog? Well, at 50%, he'd be the brothers have if who has half of my genes? My brother, right?
Mm-hmm.
At 37.5%, what is that dog compared to me? Well, he's not my brother. That would be 50%.
Mm-hmm.
But if you round up, 37.5% is almost 40%. So he's almost my brother, but not quite. Imagine, for example, you have two sisters having puppies from the same male. Now, the puppies which come out of it, are they siblings? Not really, because to be siblings, they have to come from the same mother, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But they came from her sister. So they're almost siblings. So they will be considered three-quarter siblings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not half siblings, three-quarter siblings.
Okay. Okay.
Full siblings will be from the same mother and father, right?
Right.
But if a same male is bred to two different sisters, they're not siblings, but they're almost siblings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, then there's the concept of double first cousins or double second cousins. So double first cousins is the same thing as half siblings. So what does that mean? So if two brothers marry two sisters, their kids are cousins, but they're also half siblings. How does that work mathematically? Well, you have 1/2 cubed plus 1/2 cubed plus 1/2 cubed plus 1/2 cubed. This brother, 1/2 cubed plus 1/2 cubed from him. This brother, 1/2 cubed from him, but the wife is the other half of the 1/2 cubed.
Mm-hmm.
So you have 1/2 cubed plus 1/2 cubed from this side, 1/2 cubed plus 1/2 cubed from this side,
Mm-hmm.
1/8 plus 1/8 plus 1/8 plus 1/8. Well, that's 4/8. 4/8 is 1/2.
Right.
But what do you have in half siblings? 1/2 squared plus 1/2 squared. 2, 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
1/2 squared is 1/4 plus 1/4. What's 1/4 plus 1/4? 2/4. What's 2/4? 50%. So 4 times 1/2 to the third power is the same thing as 1/2 to the second power. In other words, being cousins twice is the same thing as being half siblings. Or
Okay.
1/2 to the fourth, 4 times, is the same thing as 1/2 cubed. So 4 times 1/2 to the fourth is the same thing as 1 times 1/2 cubed twice. So it's called double first cousins, creates the equivalent of half siblings,
Mm-hmm.
or double first cousins creates the equivalent of first siblings, first cousins. In other words, let's say a dog is 1/2 to the third plus 1/2 to the third plus 1/2 to the third. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that make? Well, he's that father was the product of a first cousin mating. Okay, but that mother is the granddaughter of that same dog, but through a different set of parents.
Gotcha.
Now,
Okay.
now you take a son, which is the product of a half sibling mating, a half cousin mating, and a daughter, which is the same granddaughter but not related except to that grandfather. Now
Mm-hmm.
you've created 1/2 cubed 3 times. Well, that's almost double cousins twice.
Yeah.
So it's almost right. Now, is it the same as half siblings? Not quite.
Mm-hmm.
Not quite.
But it's
So
close.
it's close.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is these numbers tell you the relationship. You know, half siblings is 50% COR and 12.5% COI. You know, first cousins is 6.25%. Well, what's twice 6.25? 12.5.
Mm-hmm.
That's half siblings. In
Mm-hmm.
other words, you can accumulate the blood of the common ancestor repeatedly, repeating him. If you do it enough, it's like he's further up in the pedigree, even though he's in the past.
Right. 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 Yeah.
That's the difference between line breeding and inbreeding. You're accumulating the blood of the common ancestor or ancestors. There could be more than one. And the further you go back in time, the more the odds of running into a common ancestor. So if you do it once, like 4-4 mating, 1/2 fourth plus 1/2 to the fourth, eh, is that inbred? Not really.
Mm-hmm.
They have a common great great grandfather. Big deal.
Right. Yeah.
It might as well be unrelated.
Right.
But if he is repeated several times in the fifth generation, in the sixth generation, in the fourth generation, he's all over the pedigree. Now he has an influence. So if he appears only twice, it's not enough of an influence if he's far back in time. Now, if he's close, in other words, genetic influence depends on the position in the pedigree. If I'm a father, I have a lot more influence than if I'm a great grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm a great grandfather several times,
Mm-hmm.
I'm almost like a grandfather. And if it's done frequently enough, it's almost like I'm a father. In other words, by accumulating the blood of the common grandparent or great grandparents, but let's say one for the sake of easy math,
Mm-hmm.
if that grandparent is repeated enough, his influence, despite being 4 generations back, as if he's 3 generations back.
Right. Is that in some aspects almost recreating or cloning him, or just what you said, just
It's not
influence?
enough to be considered cloning because
Okay.
cloning in today's parlance, nowadays we do have genetic cloning
Yeah,
because
we do. Yeah.
we do have genetic cloning.
Mm-hmm.
What's the closest thing to cloning we can do if cloning through genetic mechanism didn't exist? In other words, let's say we're living in the 20th century as opposed to the 21st century. Let's say we're living in the 1940s,
Mm-hmm.
which is 20th century, right?
Yes.
We're not living in the 1990s, which is almost toward the end of the 20th century, but let's say we're living in the 1940s. How can I accomplish cloning without having the cloning technology? Well, I could accomplish cloning what's called backbreeding. What does that mean? I take a father, I breed, I'm not recommending this, I'm just explaining it.
Mm-hmm.
I could take a father, breed it to his own daughter. The outcome is 75% him, right? Because as a father, he's 50%. Now, he's also a grandfather, he's 25%,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then the female puppy out of that mating grows up, and when she's an adult, you mate to him again. Now he's a great grandfather, so he's 12.5%. A grandfather, he's 25%. And a father, he's 50%. Now that daughter is 87.5% him.
Mm-hmm.
That's him.
Yeah.
That's essentially him. Now, that's called a 7/8 dog.
Right.
So the dog, which is the uh, father to his own daughter, that's a 5/8 dog.
Mm-hmm.
The dog after that, bred to the same father, is a 7/8 dog.
Mm-hmm.
So you're cutting down the blood of the mother and you're increasing the blood of the father. Now, you can have a lot of genetic defects from this type of inbreeding. You can have a lot of culls. Now, back in the 19th century, they drowned pups.
Mm-hmm.
They were kind of vicious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Nowadays, you don't cull that way. You don't kill. You simply castrate and you prevent them from being able to breed.
Right.
You will simply spay and neuter.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if they have serious genetic defects and their quality of life is terrible, then you would put down through a lethal injection.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is the downside people have to think about.
Yeah.
You have to kill animals.
Mm-hmm.
If they're genetically deformed, you have to kill them.
Mm-hmm.
So in dogs, we can control inbreeding, which is incest.
Mm-hmm.
In human beings, we can't, because in dogs, you can kill genetic defects
Mm-hmm.
or castrate them or do a hysterectomy if it's a female.
Right.
In human beings, you can't do that
That's right.
unless you're living in Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
which believed in Ubermenschen and Mindermenschen,
Right.
Superman and inferior man.
Right. Right.
Anyhow, we're not going to get into that
Yes, sir.
Hitler talk,
Yeah.
but anyhow, like he felt that people which are retarded shouldn't breed.
Yeah. Yeah. He
And
will
it was called
eliminate him.
eugenics, where you would kill, literally kill, or
Hmm.
castrate people which were inferior in his mind. But
Right.
anyhow, I don't want to get into that. But bottom line is, in human beings, you can't do these kind of things, but in animals, you can. So
Right.
incest in human beings is definitely verboten. But in animals, incest is not a terrible thing because the problems with incest in human beings, like we had King Charles the Third, he had a huge jaw. He couldn't even talk. He couldn't walk until he was 4. He was
Mm.
infertile. I mean, there was or Cleopatra. She married her own brother.
Yeah.
Back
Yeah.
then, to keep the blood pure, people married their own siblings.
Right.
So what I'm saying is the inbreeding is a very bad thing, but in some parts of the past, it happened in people too.
Hmm.
But we see very serious effects of that situation. But
Yeah.
we're not going to go into that. But what I'm saying is, in dogs, you're able to keep the ones which survive. In other words, what is inbreeding? Inbreeding doesn't cause disease. Inbreeding exposes disease because the recessive trait from the male, which is the disease gene, for example, not every recessive trait is obviously diseased. But let's say we have a recessive trait which is a disease-based gene
Hmm.
for the sake of conversation. Let's say we're talking about degenerative myelopathy, which is like Lou Gehrig's disease in people.
Right.
Now it's a capital B, lowercase b. In other words, B is the dominant gene, lowercase b is the recessive gene.
Hmm.
Now it meets up with the other lowercase b from the other parent because it's the same parent on both sides. If that bad gene meets up with another bad gene, now you got 2 copies.
Yeah.
Now that gene will be expressed. Now you will cull that animal by fixing it so it doesn't get to pass its genes. Now, but the ones which didn't get that combination, they're actually healthier
Hmm.
because you bred that disease out by not allowing that animal to pass. Which the ones which survived, which didn't exhibit the trait, they're stronger because they didn't get the bad copy.
Hmm. Right.
And that's how we have the strongest thoroughbreds, which are fastest in the world, the cows which make the most milk, birds which have the highest quality poultry production for our consumption, horses which are the fastest they've ever been. Got them on the phone. Sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah.
We got a couple of.
So basically, through selective breeding, we have some of the best horses, some of the best dogs, some of the best animals that ever lived. For example, take the dog which crossed the Iditarod, a 2,000-mile race in Alaska,
Mm.
freezing cold.
Yeah.
You think any dogs which can be pulled up to a sled and pull that sled for 2,000 miles?
No, they can't. No.
No, they're selectively bred,
Yeah.
right? So basically, we're able to enhance the trait of the animal in nature. Had we not done that, we couldn't have the breeds we have today. Take a thoroughbred. Is it faster than the Arabian that it came from? Hell yeah,
Hmm.
because we took the Arabian stallion, which was already a breed, and we enhanced it through racing them and only breeding those which were the fastest ones.
Hmm.
So the Arabian was already a fast horse, but it was, raced occasionally because that was not their goal in Saudi Arabia back in the 11th, 12th, and 17th century. So we took in the 17th century, this is how long ago it's been done. From the 17th century until now, we took the Arabian stallion and created the thoroughbred and the standard bred in horses.
Hmm.
So we took the Arabian, which was a fast horse, and we made a much faster horse, which is called the thoroughbred,
Hmm. Hmm.
through selective breeding.
Now, I know we're talking about animals, and then we have brushed over human beings, but is that the same thing that's going on with like the athlete of the day? Like we're faster than they are, better. How does that come about? Because we're not
I
typically
think that it
that.
doesn't quite translate to people for a
Okay.
couple of reasons. Number one, um, first of all, we have more protein sources that we have that we had in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you have a bodybuilder, as an
Yeah.
example, or a weightlifter, which involves a lot of physical strength. In order to have a higher ratio of fast twitch muscle fibers to slow twitch muscle fibers, you have to have a lot of protein in your diet to build muscle. The
Mm-hmm.
availability of protein in Western countries, which have an adequate food supply, that didn't exist in earlier centuries. So the question is it genetics which are changing, or is it the ability to feed people which is changing?
Mm.
So in earlier centuries, even as late as the 19th century, people didn't have food based on their social class. People were poor and they were skinny. If you remember the artist Rubens, it's called Rubenesque when they talk about a plump woman.
Yeah.
He painted naked women which were fat.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the time he lived, being fat meant you were part of the upper classes
Right. Right.
because you had enough food to make you fat. The
Mm-hmm.
lower classes were skinny because food was scarce because didn't have enough money.
Right.
So the painter painted fat women, which we don't consider attractive today's times, but in the century he lived in, Rubens the painter, the women were considered Rubenesque because they were fat and plump, which was considered the standard of beauty because people didn't have enough food. So fat women were considered the most attractive in the world. So Rubens painted fat, naked women because they were fat. I mean, really, that's Rubenesque comes from that phrase.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the performance of people ties to our ability to have adequate nutrition. So that's a big factor between now and earlier centuries. If you read Charles Dickens, the Pickwick Papers, it's highly autobiographical. He was jailed because his father couldn't pay his bills. It was called debtor's prison. And back then, you couldn't declare bankruptcy and walk away from your creditors. You were jailed for not paying your bills. So
Mm-hmm.
Charles Dickens' father was jailed and he became an orphan at age 9 and lived in an orphanage. So that tells you how much money affects food and the ability to become athletic. You can't become athletic if you don't have enough to eat.
Right.
So
Right.
that's number one. Number two, there's a theory called Lamarck and Darwin. So Lamarck and Charles Darwin lived at the same time. They were contemporaries.
Mm-hmm.
Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of Species in 1859. 1859. To put that into context, the Civil War started in 1860. It was over in 1865.
Mm-hmm.
So The Origin of Species was written 1 year before the start of the Civil War. The Civil War was 150 years ago. Think about it, a century and a half.
Right.
Now, Lamarck felt that human beings could evolve and pass traits based on the characteristics acquired in life. Like a giraffe stretches its neck to reach longer branches, and therefore will develop a neck longer to be able to feed itself and could genetically pass that. The answer is it couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
It takes multiple generations to pass on a trait which is favorable to your survival. You can't do it in one generation. So Lamarck was disproven, and Charles Darwin felt it takes multiple generations to pass on a genetic trait favorable to you. So the answer to your question is, let's say I breed an athlete to, not breed, I marry, I'm using words interchangeably, but
Mm-hmm.
let's say I marry a world-class sprinter male to a world-class sprinter female, and I breed people based on physical ability. Now, will they produce sprinter children? No.
Mm-hmm.
They'll produce children which have a higher chance of becoming sprinters. But unless they're trained, they're not going to become sprinters.
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
1 second, please. Katya, я на телефоне, Katya. Katya, give me a second. Let me finish up, okay?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, we can. Yeah, we can wrap. We can wrap it
Yeah,
up.
I'm sorry. My wife is calling me.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. You
Yeah.
better get in there. You'll get in trouble.
I'll get in trouble, yeah. All right, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It
So
probably sounds urgent, so.
yeah.
But anyhow, I really enjoyed our talk.
Yes, sir.
I
Yes, sir.
really did. And
We'll do it again. We'll do
I
it
hope
again.
this was useful. I hope it was interesting to people. I hope so.
It was. So thank you much, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, sir. Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that wraps up another episode of NWA Connie Corsos. Thank you for being a part of our Connie Corso community. Remember, you can stay connected with us beyond the podcast. Find us on all major media platforms by searching for NWA Connie Corsos, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or YouTube. Just hit that follow button to join the conversation and get the latest updates. If you have a burning question or want to apply to be a guest on our show, we'd love to hear from you. Simply shoot us an email at nwaconniecorsos@gmail.com. And if you're a business interested in becoming a sponsor, reach out to us at the same email address. For more resources, exclusive content, and links to all our social media profiles, visit our website at nwaconniecorsos.com. It's your go-to destination for everything dogs. Thank you once again for tuning in, and we can't wait to bring you more exciting episodes where we explore the fascinating world of dogs.